Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
I think everybody knows the story of the Beatles when they became famous.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you.
But little is known about the formative years of the Beatles, when Pete was in, when they were the most exciting days, the Hamburg days.
Ride home every day and I'll send all my loving to you.
They're working in Liverpool before they became famous, before the Cavern even had them working.
I'll pretend that I'm kissing the lips I am missing and hope.
We were big-headed little buggers from Liverpool, right? But you know, we were fun. That was the main thing. But we were proud of what we'd done as well.
I'll ride home every day and I'll send all my loving to you.
I was impressed with them, mainly because they played their own music.
Yeah, John and Paul had this thing of being, if we're going to do this, we'll be professional songwriters.
I said, I think we ought to sign them, because I think there's more to come. So George Martin then said to me, all right, I'll think about it.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you.
The kids in Liverpool wanted to keep their Beatles, and they figured that if the Beatles got too big, they would be lost to Liverpool, and the Beatles would not come down to the Cavern Club anymore.
It was a lot of fun in those days. Obviously, we didn't know we were creating history then. We just went with the flow, which happened to be, I would say, the most creative years of the 60s were the happening of the Beatles.
All my loving, darling, I'll be true. All my loving, all my loving, all my loving, I will send to you.
In the beginning, the Beatles were a skiffle group. They sort of emerged from that particular era, and that was a time when sort of anything went, and it was a time when sort of people, the more sort of homegrown your sound, the better, which is why a lot of skiffle groups tended to use instruments made out of household implements. Later on, skiffle became very passé, and the former skiffle groups tended to acquire, either fell by the wayside, or they tended to acquire amplification and you know, abandon their old sort of Lonnie Donegan repertoire and sort of concentrate more on sort of classic rock. And at the time that the Beatles were kind of smouldering into form, all the giants of classic rock seemed to be going down, if you like. I mean, Elvis was in the army, Chuck Berry was in jail, Jerry Lee Lewis was disgraced for marrying his child bride, the Everly Brothers were about to become Marines, Buddy Holly was dead, and it entered what I call the Bobby era, which was a kind of softened down version, almost a sanitised version of rock and roll. I mean, you know, Bobby Rydell, Bobby Vinton, Bobby V, all these Bobbies, very much, you know, boys next door, rather sort of insipid with a sort of half smiles and sort of lacquered hair. And, you know, the Beatles, although they did sort of make concessions towards this sort of music, the Beatles were essentially sort of rockers through and through.
Well, she was just 17, you know what I mean, and the way she looked was way beyond compare. How could I dance with another? Oh, since I saw her standing there.
Well, I didn't even know they were a group. I had a coffee bar club named the Jacaranda downtown, and I remember having a problem with the ladies' toilets next door, because we shared it with a shop next door which sold candy, and the ladies had to share our toilets. And because of the obscene graffiti that the girls used to, you know, scroll on the wall about the private parts of Beatles and whatever, or any other groups, I had to get the toilets redecorated. And in those days, two guys that used to hang around as coffee bar layabouts was John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. There were 5 Beatles in my days. And knowing they were from the art school, I said, I've got a job for you lads. And they said, yeah, what, Alan? I said, will you decorate the ladies' toilets? Which they did. So the first money that ever changed hands between me and the Beatles was decorating the ladies' toilet. Actually, when they finished, I preferred the graffiti. But in those days, they used to hang about as coffee bar layabouts. I can still see now Paul, John, and John was having toast, and he wanted jam on the toast. And Paul telling him off, said, John, you must be mad. It's a penny extra. Now look at Paul, yeah? Would eat about a penny extra for jam on the toast. Wish he'd pay some of the jam he owed me.
Well, my heart went boom when I crossed that room, and I held her hand in mine.
I put on a big pop concert in what was then the boxing stand. It's now demolished. And I'd seen a show with Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent at the Empire Theatre, and I booked the entire show. But unfortunately, Eddie Cochran was killed in a tragic car accident 2 weeks before the concert. I said, the bloody bastard, you know, he's let me down here, badly. And then I phoned up Larry Parnes, who was the entrepreneur, and I said, is the show cancelled? He said, well, you can cancel it, of course, but Gene Vincent is willing to do it. I said, okay, we'll go ahead. So then my problem was, how do I make up for the loss of Gene Vincent? Then I got this brainwave. There were so many groups that used to hang out the Jacaranda. I thought, I'll put them on for the first half of the show. Rory Storm and Hurricanes, Jerry and the Pacemakers. And so I put the show on with Liverpool groups, which was a big success. And then when we went back to the Jacaranda after the show, Pons was so impressed with my groups. Well, they weren't my groups, I just booked them for the show. And he said, can I use them to back my artists, like maybe say Tommy Steele or something like that in Scotland? I said, yeah, sure. And so next day, I go to the Jacaranda and I'm approached, I think, by Stuart and John, because they were at the art school, which was 3 minutes away from the Jacaranda. And they used to miss the lessons sometimes and come to the Jack to listen to the groups rehearse, because it wasn't used in the daytime, the basement, so I let the groups rehearse. And I think it was Stu came up to me and said, hey Al, when are you going to do something for us like? And I thought, well, there's no more decorating to be done, that's it. He said, no, we've got a group. We were at your show last night, and would you like to manage us? And I said, well, who are you? He said, the Beatles. So it's a strange name. And I called somebody over from the Big Three, which was quite a group, and I said, can you help these lads out? And Cass from the Big Three said, what do you call yourselves? And I think John said, the Beatles. Oh, you'll never get anywhere with a stupid name like that. Because all it was Johnny Hurricane, so-and-so, was always a name and then the name of the group afterwards. So he said, what's your name? To John, he said, John. He said, Long John Silver. How about the Silver Beatles then? And they all cringed, but for the first few gigs, they went out as the Silver Beatles. I've still got contracts with the Silver Beatles on, yeah. So I became the man. I was more honoured, really, because no other groups had ever asked me to be a manager, and I'd never been a manager of a pop group, so I was more excited and looked forward to the fun of it. And from there we did all the local halls, mainly the Grove and the Ballroom, and then the Hamburg scene came in.
they were rather a clumsy group before they went to Hamburg. I mean, the group boiled down essentially to John, Paul and George, and with various drummers. They didn't sort of have any sort of drummer that they seemed to be able to hold on to for very long. They had a bass player. They managed to get one of John's colleagues at art college to buy a bass. He wasn't a particularly good bass player, Stuart Sutcliffe. And, you know, but I mean, essentially he was there just to sort of make up numbers, although they did have rather a surfeit of guitarists. And as a result, you know, Paul tended to play the piano whenever there was one available. And he also was actually quite a good drummer, and he also, with very bad grace, he used to fill in on drums whenever, you know, either the drummer didn't turn up or they simply didn't have a drummer. They were offered a season in Hamburg Clubland, providing they could find somebody to sort of sit behind the kit. And it happened that Pete Best was available, that he was reasonably competent, and he actually owned a drum kit. And so, you know, after the most cursory audition, he was in.
I was fortunate, I think, because I got to know them on a social level, you know, before I actually joined them in 1960. And I think it was one of those, you know, the more you actually mixed with them, you appreciated their humour. Knocked out by John the first time I saw him. Just loved the way he looked, you know, his image, the way he handled himself, the little quips he had, his, you know, quirky sense of humour. You know, I was doubled up in stitches, you know, before he'd even come into the club. Paul was very much the PR guy, you know, he was the prim and proper, what's the deal moaning, this type of thing. George was a little bit like well, he was the youngest in the, you know, quartet anyway. So he was like, I won't say him now to say the baby, but he was the junior member, you know, and everyone, even though he brought them down, once George sort of got into their company, they took over the, you know, the mantle. And I just found they were dead easy to get on with, right? And of course, with them playing here, socialising here, mixing upstairs in the kitchen, coming to the famous Casbah parties that used to take place upstairs, I got to know them. And of course, when I actually auditioned for them, the offer came up to go to Germany in 1960. It wasn't like auditioning for a new band. It was like auditioning for a gang of mates. You know, we were all playing the same music, we'd all done the same thing, we'd all played the same clubs. You know, it was just the fact that they were one of the first bands to go out to Germany, and they asked me. And that's how I joined them.
That boy took my love away. He'll regret it someday. You back again.
We knew we were going to play Hamburg. We were excited about the fact because we were most probably the second band from Liverpool to go into Hamburg. Derry and the Seniors being the first one out there. And Alan was responsible for it and taking us out. And as he always turned around and said, he smuggled us into Hamburg the first time. We didn't know we had to have papers and work permits and all that type of thing. It was just very much a case of your students, you know, leave it up to me and we'll get in there. But excitement in the van simply because of the fact we didn't know what Hamburg was going to be like. You know, we knew it was a port, Liverpool was a port, but when we actually got there and we hit the Reeperbahn, right, that was absolutely incredible. You know, I mean, you got to imagine we were, what, 17, 18-year-olds. And we had this maze of neon lights which just stretched the whole, whatever the Reeperbahn's length is, 1.5 miles or something like that. It made Blackpool Illuminations look, you know, like a little fairy town. It was heaving. You know, the crowd was out, the atmosphere was out. And of course we suddenly realised that this was St. Pauli. You know, this was the red light district of the world. And the more we got to know it, you know, and we found out where we were playing, the hours that we had to play, it became a second home to us. You know, St. Pauli, even though it was the red light district of the world, it was our playground. And that's what we loved about the place.
Oh, and this boy
It was hard. I mean, goodness me. I think when we first got there and we turned around and said, where are we playing? And we thought we were going to be playing in the Kaiserkeller, and of course we weren't. We were playing in the Grotty Old Indra, you know, down at the bottom end of the Große Freiheit, and we, you know, the challenge was you've got to turn this into a second Kaiserkeller, which we did. And then we got it shut down because we were playing too loud, you know, and that's another story, so to speak. But I suppose when we got there and we said, where are we playing and how long are we playing? And we were told you're playing 7 hours a night, you know, 15 minutes off every hour. It was a hell of a challenge because no one from Liverpool had played those hours before. And it was like, okay, that is a bit of a challenge. How do we do it, right? So we built ourselves up, you know, we adjusted to it. You know, as the crowds built up, there'd be certain periods during the sets when we wouldn't have to be as frantic and, you know, energetic as, you know, we would be when it was a full house. So we used to pace ourselves. And, you know, we'd add solos into numbers to make them last longer. So, you know, you might get on a hot night, you know, when the crowd's packed, you might get a, you know, version of What I Say, which would last for about 15 minutes. But the crowd loved it, you know, and as long as the crowd was up and yelling for more, we were up for more, you know. If the crowd emptied a little bit, we'd take it down a step. We became very professional. We grew up there.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, baby. Come on and work it all out.
Most of the bands in Liverpool were doing covers, you know, which ranged from Little Richards to Chuck Berry, the Everly Brothers, you name it, right? We were fortunate in as much that, you know, with the scale of voices we had, you know, I mean, they were very good, you know, harmony-wise. Each singer had their own identity, you know. John was Chuck Berry and Gene Vincent, Paul was Little Richard, Ray Charles, you know, George was Carl Perkins, you know, Eddie Cochran, all this type of stuff. So they were the, you know, the songs that we were playing. That's what we cut our teeth on.
They weren't playing their own music then, but there again, they had so much time in Hamburg that they were writing their own music. That's why they were able to produce so many. They'd already done it in Hamburg. When they were almost due to come home, there was another club called the Top 10. They were playing in the Kaiserkeller. Now, in the Top 10, there was a fantastic musician playing there called Tony Sheridan. Now, in their intervals, they used to go round to the Top 10 to listen to Tony Sheridan. In fact, they owe a lot to Tony Sheridan, their music abilities. They learned a big deal from Tony Sheridan. And then Koshmideh had a bit of a spy called Herr Steiner, and he used to report to Koshmideh that the lads had done a deal that when they come back to Hamburg, they were going to play at the Top 10 club. So he invented a story that they tried to set fire to the living quarters, which obviously was an old variety theatre. And what were the dressing rooms was their living accommodation. They had no water whatsoever. I don't think it had been cleaned for about 20 years. And when they were messing about, getting ready to go home, I think Paul lit a condom which scorched the wall because of the dust was about half an inch thick, so it just left a black mark on the wall. And so he reported them to the police. When the police came round, they had no work permits, which Koshmideh had promised to get, which he didn't.
And he took very great measures to ensure that they would never work in Hamburg again. He discovered that George Harrison was actually a minor at the time and shouldn't be working in a red light district after midnight, which he had been doing. And so he arranged for George to be deported. It was more or less the finish of their first season in Hamburg, and it ended very ignominiously But it had hidden benefits, because by the time they returned to Liverpool, they were an absolutely peerless live act.
We conquered Hamburg as far as we were concerned. Right, that was, you know, we'd done 4 months there, should have been a month. We were kicked out on the way back. We came back, reformed. The lifeline was thrown here at the Casbah, 19th of December. This is where Beatlemania started, at the Casbah. Okay. Regardless of what other people turn around and say, some people turn around and say it was Littleton Town Hall on the 27th. It wasn't. Mo gave them a lifeline, and the first gig they did in Liverpool on the return back from Hamburg was here. It seemed funny actually, because it always ended up, the first gig we came back from Hamburg and the last gig before we went to Hamburg was always the Casbah. Wasn't planned that way, but when you look back in hindsight, it happened. But that particular night, the first night the Beatles played here, the reaction from the Liverpool audiences, you couldn't move in here. Right? There were kids squashed on the ceilings. Health and safety didn't exist, right, as far as we were concerned then. And the word went out on the street. And, you know, the next time they played in Liverpool, it was just, got to go and see the Beatles. You know, the word was out. We'd taken Liverpool by storm. So, of course, consequently, as a result of that, you know, conquering Hamburg on the first trip out, coming back, because we'd been virtually unknown before we went out, but then came back and delivered this powerhouse show, so that basically every promoter in Liverpool was screaming out for us. I think when we started to establish ourselves in Liverpool and on the second trip back to Germany, that's when we started to experiment a little bit. It was like, okay, let's throw a couple of songs which we've written ourselves. And because we've set the pattern, because when we came back to Liverpool, a lot of bands, the image we had and the type of music we were playing, the style of it, the savageness of it, the power of it, just basically blew people away. Audiences had never seen it before. But here we were, you know, 5 lads from Liverpool delivering it, you know, on your doorstep. And a lot of bands in Liverpool changed overnight, consequently as a result of that. You know, they'd been very lightweight before that. A little bit like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, dressed in sparkly suits, very clean cut. You know, all of a sudden, you know, leather jackets were, everyone had a leather jacket. There was a muso in Liverpool. And the image changed. So consequently, as a lot of the bands followed suit with the Beatles, and the image changed and the type of material they were playing became very heavy and frenetic. Basically what the Merseybeat sound is today, what it's recognised for. To be one step ahead of them, and it was always one-upmanship, right? We turned around and said, because a lot of people, they may have been writing songs, but they didn't have the courage to perform them on stage. That was the big thing, and it was like when, a little bit like one-upmanship, where you turn around and say, and here's a song which we've written ourselves, and we're going to play it. And you can see there's a atmosphere in the audience is like, hang on a minute, what's this going to be like? We're fortunate we had great songwriters, Lennon and McCartney, right? So even their early stuff, which is world famous now, you know, when we started doing the likes of, you know, like Dreamers Do and Love of the Loved, they went down fantastic with the audiences. They loved them, you know, and of course that was, Beatles are writing their own material. Everyone started writing in Liverpool.
It was harder to get them back the second time because of the deportment order. But this time, instead of being smuggled in as students, they went in as musicians. I had to sign an affidavit to say I would be responsible for any misbehaviour. And also the guy at the top 10, Peter Eckhorn, he had to sign a similar thing. So if they made any bad mistakes or robbed or anything wrong, I would be responsible, or Peter Eckhorn would be responsible.
You know, when we went back to Hamburg, it was a different club. It was the top 10 club, which was the best club in town at that present moment. You know, the audience was a little bit more upbeat, even though, you know, the crowd from the Kaiserkeller is still playing. because that was the only place they could see the Beatles. So Peter Echo, who owned the Top 10, was very much, you know, rubbing his hands, because the Kaiser Keller was, you know, which was his rival, round the corner, was paling into insignificance. He had Sheridan, right? Tony Sheridan was the house musician. He had the Beatles, and they were the two biggest names in Hamburg. And he had them under one roof, playing on the same stage. And his club was packed every night. So with that atmosphere and that infamy that we had, you know, we were riding high. You know, we were big-headed little buggers from Liverpool, right? But you know, we were fun. That was the main thing. But we were proud of what we'd done as well. We needed to go back, and I think the reason for it was what was happening in Liverpool. It was dance halls, and we felt that the opportunity we had in Hamburg, right, playing in a club as a residential band, was something which wasn't going on in Liverpool. Right, we were playing great. We were playing 7 nights a week. You know, a lot of other bands are only playing once or twice a week. But going back there and playing under one roof and being in the public eye all the time, and you know, because Hamburg was a fast becoming a music city, you know, so there's, as well as Liverpool, a lot of people in Hamburg, you know, as regards the record industry and the fact that the bands were from Liverpool, were starting to take an interest in, you know, what we would call English music or English artists that were appearing over there. So it seemed sense to go back. And as it so happened, you know, second trip back, Bert Kempfert signed us up, which was great for us. We were at the Top 10 for about 3 months, and round about middle of May, end of May, we were told by Peter Echo that Bert Kempfert, who was the biggest A&R man in Germany at that time, with Polydor Records, was interested. People had seen the band, fed it back to him, and he was interested in seeing it for himself. And he came down and watched us a couple of times, but we always got the tip-off from the manager of the club when he was in the audience. So, you know, it was like Bert Kempfert's in the audience, and away we'd go. I'll do some of the choice numbers, you know, to impress him. But he was impressed with the band anyway. He liked the harmonies, he liked Sheridan, he liked the combination of the, you know, the two together, and the fact that he could record Tony by himself and the Beatles by themselves. So one particular night, at the end of the night, he turned around and called us over, and in a nutshell basically turned around and said, you know, love to record you, you know, love to sign you up. We'll set a date, you know, where you're going to record in Germany for the Polydor label. And that date was set, you know, for sometime in June, you know, just before we left. And of course, over those 2 days, 2 or 3 days that we were there, My Bonnie came to fruition, and Cry for a Shadow and Ain't She Sweet, which are household names now in the music industry.
1, 2, 3, da 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 da. If there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do, just call on me and I'll sing it along with love from me to you. I got everything.
When they came back, I was still struggling, and then Brian Epstein came onto the scene, and he was sort of bored, failed amateur actor, and he was looking for something like the Beatles, and he did a good job with him. I've never knocked Brian Epstein. He was like the fifth Beatle, because the fifth Beatle, who was Stuart Sutcliffe, stayed on because he'd fallen in love with a girl called Astrid Kirchner, who was a photographer. So he left the group, and Brian, although he couldn't play, became the fifth Beatle, and he worshipped them.
We just rose from strength to strength, and consequently, as a result of that, you know, a certain fella called Brian Epstein, right, started to take interest with people going into the shops, and the famous Brian Jones story, which is actually true. A lot of people think that that's, you know, a made-up story. There was a Brian Jones, and he did ask for, you know, My Bonnie. And as we all know now, Brian, he said it was by the Beatles. And it wasn't, as Brian found out, it was Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, you know, what we were alluding to before. But he turned around and said to Brian, you got to go and see them. You know, they're playing at the Cavern down the road. You got to go there, mister, and go and watch them. They're the best band you can see in your life. And I think Brian had read about us in the Merseybeat as well. We'd always been in NEMS, you know, making a nuisance of ourselves, because the minute we walk into NEMS, listen to the records, you know, the booths they used to have in those days, the shop would come to a standstill virtually, you know. The girls behind the counter would be, oh God, it's the Beatles, you know, do you want to listen to the new releases? And they was like, yeah, okay. And, you know, there'd be mayhem going on, to be quite honest. And, you know, he must have known who we were, and, you know, with the advent, curiosity got the better of him. You know, who the hell are the Beatles? I've got to go and see them. You know, story goes, he went down to the Cavern, stood in the shadows, watched the Beatles, fell in love with them, and next thing we knew was a message passed down to us. And Brian wanted to sign us up and become manager, which is what he did eventually.
I got arms that long to hold you and keep you by my side. I've got lips that long to kiss you and keep you satisfied. If there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do, just call on me and I'll send it along with love from me to you. From me to you, just call on me and I'll send it along with love from me to you.
We'd already turned around and said we were Polydor recording artists. Right? That was a big word on the grapevine, because one of the first bands to be signed up in Liverpool. Okay, it didn't matter whether it was a German label, it was the biggest German label. Right? And of course, it was great for the posters and the publicity and everything else. And, you know, the crowd, which was great, you know, they wanted us back. We'd been away 3 months, you know, and their favourite band, or one of the favourite bands, you know, was coming back home again. They were going to be playing the local scenes, they were going to be playing the Casbah, they were going to be playing the Cavern, you know, the local haunts. They were back in the vicinity again. You know, the kids in Liverpool could see them, not just hear about them.
In terms of what Brian did, is he made them acceptable as best he could. They were still little rogues in the real life. They looked smart and presentable. They didn't swear on stage anymore, didn't smoke on stage anymore. And he was the only person that, at the time, could have turned them into what they were. He was the only person with that perseverance. You know, anyone else that had managed or been involved with them had just given up, or they didn't have the ambition to crack them out of that. And without Brian, the Beatles might never have cracked out of Liverpool, you know, because other proper managers, you say, like Larry Parnes and who managed, you know, the Billy Furies and those people, they'd all seen the Beatles and just paid no attention to them. Just sort of, you know, they hadn't collared what they were all about. Brian was the one who actually saw that possibility that they could make a record, they could play further south than Leicester. You know, they could. I mean, it wasn't long before he was saying, you know, they'd be bigger than Elvis, and people. And of course, they did become bigger than Elvis. His management style was a bit bizarre because he'd never been a manager. But as soon as he took them under his wing, it was only 6 months before they got a record contract, and as soon as he took them over, he doubled and tripled the amount of money that they were earning at gigs. You know, the promoters and management people before we just thought they just paid them £5 or £1 each, you know, that'll do them for the night. Brian immediately insisted that he got a fair whack of what was taken at the ticket office. most places. So they were suddenly earning £15 a night. Right. Before Love Me Do came out, they were earning 50 quid a week each more, which was a damn lot of money for a gang of scallywags.
I got arms that long to hold you and keep you by my side. I got lips that long to kiss you and keep you satisfied. Ooh, if there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do, just call on me and I'll send it along with love from me to you, to you, to you, to you.
What we wanted was an English recording contract. That was the big thing. We had this recording contract in Germany because of the sheer economics of it, having to go over there, record. We felt, now hang on a minute, there's, recording companies in England, Decca, EMI, you name it, Decca being the biggest. Let's try and get a deal with them. And that was the mission which, we gave Brian. We turned around and said we want an English, recording contract. And he did. He went to because of his contacts within, the record industry, he went to the biggest record company that was going at that time, Decca, right? Bent their ear, got Mike Smith, dear old Mike, to come down and watch the Beatles at the Cavern. And Mike was absolutely knocked out with them, and hence that, famous or infamous Decca audition, Jan 1, 1962. But that was the speed he was moving at, right? Because he'd only been a manager on paper for a couple of months, so to land an audition within a couple of months with the biggest record company in England, right, as well as grooming us and polishing us, he was setting a fine example to us. So there was nothing that we could turn around and say, hang on a minute, this guy's not doing anything for us. He was, he was flying.
There were bells on a hill, but I never heard them ringing.
I was working at Decca Records as, I think, the only full-time sleeve note writer, liner notes on the back of albums. I think I was the only one in Britain. But I was also doing, as a sideline, the Liverpool Echo record column, which I'd been doing since sixth form school days. And Brian Epstein wrote to me at the Liverpool Echo under my nom de plume that I'd written under, and to his surprise got a letter back from somebody named Tony Barrow in London, and he came to see me, and he at Decca, and he brought with him an acetate, a demo disc that he said had been made by a television company who were making a documentary about the Beatles at the Cavern Club, and he said that this acetate had been taken from their soundtrack, and that's why it was poor quality. It was only many years later that I discovered that this was a little white lie, because what he'd actually done and why it was poor quality is that he had stood in the middle of the cavern with a very old, what today would be an antique Philips cassette tape recorder, and held a mic in the air and got the sound from around him. Well, the sound of the Cavern Club that he had captured was great. You could get the sort of electrifying feeling, the ambience of this place, the excitement of it, but you certainly couldn't really tell very much about his band. You couldn't tell what the Beatles were like as such. And I kind of did a "Don't Call Us, We'll Call You" thing on him at Decca, but it wasn't my place to do that. I mean, I wasn't there to hire or fire the talent. I was there to write these liner notes, sleeve notes for the albums, but I really didn't see that what he got there was anything special from what he had played to me. But when he left Decca, I picked up the internal phone and rang not the production department, not the producers, not the artists people at all, but the marketing department at Decca on the internal phone, because I knew that Brian Epstein had record shops in Liverpool. And at first the people in the marketing department sort of said, no, Epstein, no, don't know that name. Is that the name of the shops? And I said, no, the shops are called NEMS, North End Music Stores. Immediately the marketing department sprang to attention and saluted and said, NEMS, one of our greatest customers in the northwest of England, this band has to have an audition. And it was through me and a number of other people. I mean, he obviously sort of pushed the local sales reps and everybody else that he could, whose ears he could get the attention of. So several different sources were all sort of saying to Decca, audition the Beatles. All this led to what became a disastrous New Year's Day audition the following, on New Year's Day, in fact, in 1962.
And there was music. Wonderful roses, they tell me, in sweet, fragrant meadows of dawn and dew, there was love all around.
This was an audition, it was a very important audition. As Brian went to great bones to tell us about before we went down there. You know, you must go to bed early, and of course, at past 2 in the morning, we're in the middle of Trafalgar Square, doing certain things which we shouldn't be doing, and got to the session hungover. But yeah, I mean, it was New Year's Day. The excitement was there. We played about 14 or 15 numbers. Not our choice. I mean, that if there's one thing which I'd turn around and say about Brian, was the choice of material he made us play on that particular day didn't do us any justice. I can see that the wisdom in it was that he wanted to show Decca the cross-section of material we could do, from out-and-out rockers to great harmonies to country and western to original material. But as Mike Smith turned around and said, what he actually saw in the Cavern didn't come over studio-wise. And that was one of the reasons why we never got the gig with Decca.
But the sting in the tail here is that the myth down the years has always been that every other major record company in London turned the Beatles down. What they actually turned down was not the Beatles, but that same Decca audition tape, because that's all Brian Epstein had to hawk around the other record companies, and he was taking this around with him, and of course they were turning it down because it wasn't a very good audition. I mean, it was a long time afterwards that I heard the Decca audition tracks, and I must confess that if I had been listening to them as a producer, I don't think I would have contracted the Beatles.
We thought that we had Decca's contract in the bag. You know, final words from Mike Smith were, don't worry lads, we even went out and celebrated. You know, St. John's Wood, big lavish dinner, on Brian of course. But you know, the wine was flowing, etc, etc. We all came back in high spirits, and then a couple of weeks afterwards we were turned around and told, you know, on a bummer, Decca turned you down. They signed Mike Poole and the Tremolos. So that, to us, was like red rag to a bull. And it was, okay, Brian, coin an expression, get it back on your bike again and, you know, get us a contract. And as we know now, Decca being the biggest company, he took the tapes from Decca and he hawked them around London, all the record companies. He wasn't getting on. They weren't biting. Till someone heard them, and cut a long story short because it's well chronicled, it caught the ear, or gave someone the interest to actually bring it to George Martin.
I was sitting at the console waiting for them to arrive. The door opened and in walked George Martin himself. And I thought, oh, this is going to be some sort of special artist test. It's the first time that the main producer has ever arrived. Anyway, long before the door opened of the studio, and in walked these 4 guys. Of course, it was a double take when I looked at their hairstyling, etc. You know, never seen anything quite like that, all looking exactly the same hairstyle-wise. So in number 2, the control room is above the studio, and you have to go down steps to the actual studio. So I went down and introduced myself, and they in turn introduced themselves, and you know, John, Paul, George, Pete, as it was then, Pete Best. And by them, their accent then, I picked up, these are Liverpudlian. And I had a soft spot for Liverpudlian humour. they started to sing and perform their numbers. I think the first one was Besame Mucho, an old movie song, I think it was. And they had no indication at all that of their forthcoming songwriting ability. Didn't have any indication of that. So anyway, it wasn't very impressive at all. But I liked them. You know, their bits of their humour was coming out, particularly John and Paul, and George. Well, he was a bit of an introvert anyway, George. So anyway, you know, they weren't impressive at all. So George said, well, I think we better bring George Martin, better bring them up. So we did, we brought them up, and then George Martin started to address them to say what he was looking for and what they got to do. We were looking for certain songs and, you know, and the way they treat it and head arrangements and all that kind of thing. Then he handed them over to me, and they went on about the equipment, you know, and I suggested certain equipment that they got to get, including Pete Best's cymbals, you know, all that sort of thing. And anyway, went on for about 20 minutes, this dressing them down, sermonising. And then at the end, George Martin said to them, he said, well, look, we've been having a go at you for some time. Is there anything you want to say to us? They just stood there, silence, nothing. And they were looking George up and down, looking me up and down. Nothing at all. Then all of a sudden, it was George Harrison looking at George Martin. He said, yeah, I don't like your tie, he said. And, you know, to me, I nearly fell off my chair, laughing. Tears were running down my face. And then some more humour came out, you know. And anyway, eventually they left the control room, left George and I there. I was wiping the tears away from my face, and George said to me, well, what do you think? So I said, well, I've never seen anything. I've tested quite a number of these guitar groups. I've never seen anything like these guys. I know what we've heard today is, you know, pretty rubbishy, I said, but I think we ought to sign them, because I think there's more to come. So George Martin then said to me, all right, I'll think about it.
And on the results of that, we got signed up, and the recording date was set for 6th of June 1962, which was just after we'd come back from Hamburg for the third time, right? Because we'd opened the Star Club. And of course, congratulations while we were away, because, you know, Bert Kempford had released us from our Polydor contract. And we can now turn around and say we were EMI recording cars, which is a big company in England. And by now, Brian had got us onto BBC, you know, Teenagers Turn, Manchester Playhouse, so we were broadcasting stars as well, you know, so it was like, you know, the only thing that we hadn't conquered yet was TV. But that was to come, but not during my stay with them anyway. But yeah, 6th of June, we were adamant about the fact that we wanted to record our own material. Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, we'd practice on the German crowds, the Star Club. Changed the format, the arrangement several times, till we were quite happy with it. And even though George Martin wanted us to record other people's material, we were adamant about the fact that no, you know, we write our own material and we're going to record our own material. And we were quite dogmatic about it, actually. And if it was anyone else's material, we wouldn't pay too much attention to it. We'd do a cack-handed version of it, right, to make sure that our material was stronger. And hence Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, they were the ones that, you know, the first ones that we wanted to record.
The first proper session came along, still with Pete Best drumming, and that was Love Me Do, started that. But this time, George Martin's assistant turned up to do it, no George Martin. So it was Ron Richards that turned up and was left to Ron and myself to produce Love Me Do. It didn't turn out to be too good, I'm afraid, mainly because Well, I think it was the head arrangement of Love Me Do, because all their stuff was head arrangement. They didn't read music, it was all head arrangements that happened. And anyway, Ron then postponed the session then, and it was 2 or 3 weeks later, I think, when they came in again. But before that, Ron had reported back to George Martin, saying that he thought Pete Best had got to go, that he thought his drumming wasn't good enough.
We played the Cavern the night before, and it was very much a case of Brian came up and just, again, the usual thing, you know, with handling the business side before. There'd been business meetings, and it was very much a case, Pete, I want to see you in the office in the morning. And I thought, yeah, okay, it's another, you know, chew the fat one, talk about promoters, should we put the price up, what's this venue like? Usual stuff you talked about. And I said, okay. So I said, yeah, get there about 10:30. So he said, yeah, that's fine. Jumped in the van with Neil, came home. He dropped me off the next morning at Nems. He turned around and said, I'll wait for you, Pete. So I said, yeah, you know, only be a couple of minutes. And went in, and I could tell that Brian was very aggravated and anxious. And he talked around the subject for a while, and then he just turned around and said, Pete, he said, I don't really know how to turn around and tell you this. He said, the boys want you out, and it's already been arranged. And I think that was the key word, already been arranged, that Ringo would join the band on Saturday. And this was either Wednesday or Thursday. And that was the bombshell, you know. So when you walk in Copper Hoop, not expecting anything, because there'd been no forewarning or, you know, we're not happy with you in the band or anything like this. When you're confronted with that, to be quite honest, your brain was scrambled, right? And I was standing there gasping for air, you know, trying to get my brain to work, and I just basically turned around and said, you know, well, what's the reason for it? And the reason it was given at the dismissal was I wasn't a good enough drummer. They felt Ringo was better. And I've always disputed that. A lot of people have seen me play then and since. I've always turned around and said it's a matter of choice, you know. But at that time I was reputed to be one of the best drummers in Liverpool. So it didn't hold up water, didn't make sense, but at that present moment in time, you know, even if you just said anything else, it still wouldn't have made sense. And it was just, okay, can't get your brain thinking. If that's the way they want it, I'm off. And he asked me to play 2 gigs with them till Ringo sat in, and I suppose you could turn around and say, brain-wise, being brain dead, I agreed to do it. And it was only when I got back home again and turned around and said, hang on a minute, I can't play 2 gigs with these guys who just kicked me out. But Brian had covered himself on that because he had Johnny Hutch playing on the same bill. So when I didn't show up, Johnny Hutch stood in for me. But it was only when I got back home again that the true force of the dismissal hit me. You know, when I walked out again, Neil was in the van and he went, what's happened? And I went, I've been kicked out. And he just went, I don't believe it. And we didn't say anything until we got back home again.
Peter Best came all the way from England to tell us that 2 years ago he made a big career move. He left his job, which is not in itself unusual, except for one little thing. The job he had was as the drummer.
Oh, my, Ringo.
He was Ringo's predecessor in the Beatles. Now, Peter, how long were you with the Beatles?
I was with them 2.5 years.
That was before they had the hairdos,
yeah,
right?
That was it.
Now I'm going to say the word that I'm sure it's on everyone's lips. Why did you leave the Beatles?
Well, at that time I, thought I'd like to start a group of my own.
Yes.
And I thought that at that time also that they weren't going to go as big as what they are now.
At the very beginning, I asked John what the situation was with Pete Best, and John said, Pete Best is a great drummer, Ringo Starr is a great Beatle. And that was something that meant a great deal to me. I knew exactly what he meant, although I was only just getting to know the Beatles at the time. That is the point. Pete Best was fine as a musician, no problems, but somehow he wasn't a Beatle, whereas Ringo Starr fell very naturally into the role of one of the Fab Four.
I'd like to do something we don't often do, and there he is singing that crack naturally, all nervous and out of tune, Ringo!
Pete was a great, noisy, loud, thumping drummer, but he was never like with the other three. I mean, if you saw them out at night after a gig, at the Blue Angel or one of the late night drinking spots, Pete was never with them. He'd always gone home with the equipment and his girlfriend, Kathy, and the other three would be falling around in low dives, and Ringo was always in those places as well, and joining in as with a very similar way of life and a sense of humour.
So really, quite apart from his talent, which was undoubted, Pete Best was okay. He looked good and he sounded good on stage with the Beatles. There has been talk that there was a bit of jealousy on Paul's part, that maybe Pete Best looked too good on stage for the good of the rest of the band, and Paul in particular. But I don't know whether that played any part. You would have to ask other people that one. But it was not because he was untalented. John may have been right. Maybe it was that Pete Best just wasn't a Beatle, didn't fit into the gang of four like that. But I do believe, although Pete Best has denied it personally to me, I do believe that the whole business of Brian Epstein and Mona Best and the possible problems that there would have been in the management side of things did play their part in Pete having to be dropped from the band at that time, to his personal absolute utter devastation, desolation.
It wasn't how he was playing, it was what he was playing that was all wrong, in my view, because I was very used to head arrangements, because I had my own jazz quintet and nearly all ours were head arrangements. And anyway, of course, I was just a sound engineer. I had nothing to do with production at that time. So they got together and Pete had to go. Ringo came into the group. So then we started doing Love Me Do Again. This time with George Martin. I think Ron was in there as well at the same time. It was a double production job. And again, Ringo's drumming did not impress. And I was dying to say, it's not what they're playing, how they're playing, it's what they're playing. But I thought, well, I better keep out of it, keep stum. And anyway, the next thing happened was that Ringo was taken off and a session drummer was brought in, a session drummer called Andy White, who I knew very well.
I didn't even know who I was going to play with. He just said, can you be at Abbey Road at 10 o'clock in the morning? Okay, bring your drums. Ringo was there. He didn't like it very much. No. But we didn't speak. And apart from just saying hello, that's what being introduced. Yeah, I think he talks about it still. And I spent most of the time learning the routines, because they didn't use written music, but they had routines for those numbers. So I would rehearse with them to get the breaks and, you know, things like that, what they wanted, because they'd been playing them for a while. You know, they had a routine for each number, so that's what, and we'd work on one until we had it, you know, more or less the way they wanted it, and then start doing takes. And when you finish that one, you go on to learn the next one too.
Andy had listened to their head arrangement, and he started playing almost exactly how I thought it should be played, funnily enough. And I thought, that's how it should be done. And of course, that's how the master was achieved, with Andy White playing drums for Love Me Do.
I mean, you can tell Andy White's version and Ringo's version of Love Me Do. Ringo's a little bit heavier. My version was totally different. And I think the unfair thing about people who sort of listen to my version and sort of compare it with Andy's version and Ringo's version is that mine wasn't a finished version. Right, that was dropped in a couple of tracks, and that was just dropped for the edification of letting George Martin and the sound engineers know what the song was about. Okay, and you know, to let them think about it. And of course, the next time they came back, you know, they'd have a better idea as regards what the arrangement was. So you know, when you listen to it, I listen to it, and it's like, well, yeah, it's not a finished recording. You know, it's like a glorified demo. You know, that's one way of looking at it. The song changed an awful lot when Andy took over, and that was George Martin's arrangement, you know, compared with the way that we as the Beatles, not me, okay, had performed Love Me Do to the audiences. You know, there was a change of beat, it was slightly different, it was slower, and the change of beat was put in because that was fascinating to the audiences.
And all I gotta do is act naturally.
Recording studios were places people just couldn't book a recording studio and wander in those days. You know, there had to be someone sensible in charge of these valuable equipment. I mean, the EMI was like a laboratory. It wasn't like these sort of do-it-yourself places they have nowadays. You know, people wore white coats and brown coats, and they called each other sir and mister, and they wore ties, and you know, it was a serious business, making records. So somebody had to be in charge on EMI's behalf, and it was George Martin. And he was brilliant. He sort of understood almost immediately what the Beatles were about. I don't think he quite understood originally, right at the very beginning, but after a few attempts with them, he realised that, you know, what they were and how talented they were, as he could only compliment them.
Love, love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So love me do.
The Beatles weren't the first Merseyside group to get to #1. That was Jerry and the Pacemakers. It happened very gradually. I mean, they'd made records in Germany backing a singer called Tony Sheridan. I mean, they were bad records, but they were records all the same. But the first sort of bona fide single was Love Me Do, which sort of crept into the sort of very edge of the top 20, largely because of the buzz from up north and scattered sort of spinnings on Radio Luxembourg.
It was quite a while before I was able to get the national newspapers very interested. Up here in Liverpool, the record went straight to #1. It was immediately bought in large quantities, but not quite large quantities as the local record record retailers had imagined.
Love me do. Oh, love me do.
There is this story that Brian Epstein bought about 10,000 copies of the first single to buy it into the charts. Well, the truth of it is, one, it went straight to #1 in Liverpool on the truth of actual sales figures for the Merseyside area. I can promise you that. I was around at the time and I know it was. But two, Brian Epstein did burn his fingers because he had bought too many copies. But he was not alone. I'm pretty sure that a number of retailers in Liverpool, not just NEMS, bought extra large quantities expecting the Beatles to be huge sellers. They weren't. They were enough. They sold enough to make it to #1 in the area at the time, but they did not sell in the huge numbers that a lot of people locally in the business had hoped and thought, simply because the kids in Liverpool wanted to keep their Beatles, and they figured that if the Beatles got too big and would immediately leave Liverpool, that if the Beatles gained national and international popularity, they would be lost to Liverpool, and the Beatles would not come down to the Cavern Club anymore.
Love me do, oh, love me do, yeah, love me do.
And after that they went for the jugular with Please Please Me.
Last night I said these words to my girl. I know you never even tried.
We did a take of Please Please Me, which I think was released on the album, the first album, although Ringo played on the single, which was the big hit of Please Please Me.
Which was a much sort of more commercially viable prospect, and that sort of almost but not quite made it to #1. It was blocked by a record by a singer called Frank Ifield.
You don't need me to show the way out. Why do I always have to say that?
He was very much sort of in vogue at the time, but you know, within several months, I mean, he was, you know, on the way out. He was in areas where sort of current hit parade status didn't matter. I mean, the beat and you know, all sort of solo artists like him, Helen Shapiro, you know, were suddenly drowned in the riptide of Merseybeat, and the Beatles spearheaded that. Well, the Beatles and Jerry and the Pacemakers. Jerry, his first 3 records all went to #1. The Beatles had a #2, and then from then on it was plain sailing for them.
No, you never even tried.
Well, from then on, Beatlemania really started.
At that time, I mean, I think that the British public needed a break from very serious news. There'd been a lot going on. There'd been the Profumo scandal, the great train robbery, that's the usual sort of east-west, black-white tensions, and the West Indies had beaten us at cricket. And what we wanted was something a bit sort of jovial, you know, something a bit safe. And there it was.
Because we were doing things and we were crossing boundaries and doing things that other bands weren't doing, and it was always exciting. It was always, each day you look forward to it. It wasn't like waking up and going, oh God, here we go, what are we going to do today? It was like, let's wake up and let's get on with life. That was it. That's where the time passed so fast. You know, it was so exciting. There were so many things going on, different directions. You know, it was great to be part of.
She said you heard her song. She almost lost her mind. Now she said she knows you're not the hurting kind. She said she loves you. You know that
the Beatles proved that, you know, the group could be something, a self-contained entity, without being a sort of somebody in the somebodies like Cliff Richard and the Shadows. And everybody in the group could be a personality in its own right. Even the drummer skulking behind everybody else, you know, toiling behind his kit, could actually come across. And it reached the point where the thought of a Beatles without John, Paul, George or Ringo in it was unthinkable. The chemistry of the group couldn't be altered in any way. You couldn't add any catalyst or any alien elements, and that's what I think gave them their strength.
The time was right. It was just this buzzing of mass hysteria. Probably happens every 20 years or something in some form or other. I don't know. But they just captured it completely.
big lie.